Hello, and thank you for joining me on another one of my adventure travel series videos. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dmitry, and I'm an American expat living in the Philippines. If you find this video entertaining, please make sure to like and subscribe to my channel. And now sit back, relax, and enjoy as I take you on an exciting adventure of the time-lapse traveler. Hello and welcome to this fourth episode from the once-in-a-lifetime trip to Cuba that I made as a group with my wife Khrys, together with her two colleagues Igor and Angela, as well as her two friends Marife and her brother Paul. They were all a really fun bunch to travel around the country with, and I'm happy to now call them my friends. We came to Cuba in the last days of December 2017 to celebrate the incoming new year, as well as to enjoy all the amazing party atmosphere, history and culture of this truly one-of-a-kind destination. As I mentioned previously, this was a time before I started making my vlogs that are designed to be shared in places such as YouTube, and I didn't have any kind of a decent camera for that task. So the video I do have is complemented by some of the photos that I took there. Here we start with the famous Museum of the Revolution. Definitely the best place to start when learning about the modern history of Cuba. This building started out as a presidential palace after it was inaugurated in 1920 and housed every president starting with Maria Garcia Manacal until President Fidel Castro had it transformed into a Museum of the Revolution in 1974. He had actually been an enemy of the close neighbor, the US, ever since he seized power after the Cuban Revolution in January 1959. His armed revolt had toppled the American-backed military dictator Fulgencio Batista, who was very friendly to the interests of American capitalism at the expense of his own people. After taking control, Castro forced the nationalization of all privately controlled companies as well as American interests. This was part of a larger movement of the Cuban government taking over all private businesses throughout the island that were operating under the previous regime. This made international investment and business operation that is vital for creating livelihood for the country's people all but impossible. Sadly, Fidel Castro, along with the rest of the communist leadership, seemed to be convinced that they could simply follow in the footsteps of countries such as the USSR and China in a self-sufficient way of life. Whereas those other countries did have some great success on the surface, if you can at least avoid thinking of the extreme mismanagement and horrible human rights abuses. Despite the progress of having some of the highest literacy rates with a low wealth gap and accessible medical care, Cuba was stuck with all the hardships and none of the natural advantages they tried to copy from the other communist countries. As a result, this experiment with such form of government turned out to be overall one of the biggest failures of the 20th century. Being a tropical island nation, it can truly be our beach lover's paradise. If there was at least one beach that we would visit, it had to be like no other in the world. That for us was this historically famous beach known as the Bay of Pigs. What makes this beach famous was the embarrassingly failed invasion attempt being directed by the US Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. What was supposed to be a popular uprising against Fidel Castro only solidified him as the military and political leader of the country, a position that he would maintain for close to half a century, thanks in large part to this American intervention. Castro's strong anti-American stance, and almost by default, his movement towards a closer relationship with America's biggest cultural rival, the Soviet Union, led US officials to conclude that Castro was a threat to the US interests in the Western Hemisphere. In March 1960, President Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered the Central Intelligence Agency to train and arm a small force of Cuban exiles for an armed attack on Cuba. John F. Kennedy inherited this program when he became president in 1961. Though many of his military advisors indicated that assault on Cuba from the sea by a group of lightly armed exiles had little chance of success. Kennedy gave the go-ahead for the attack on April 17, 1961. Around 1,200 exiles, armed with American weapons and using American landing craft, got onto the shore right here in the Bay of Pigs for a very quick and disastrous defeat. The intention was that this exile force would serve as a rallying point for the Cuban citizens to overthrow Castro's government. Little did they know, but the average Cuban farmer cared very little for what the US government thought would be the best form of government for them, and had nothing but bad memories of the pro-American dictator, Fulgencio Batista, who murdered 20,000 Cubans in the 7 years that he was in power, and turned the democratic Cuba into a totalitarian police state, while destroying every individual liberty, and using the name of the United States in support of his reign of terror. Needless to say, this plan immediately fell apart, as the landing force was met with unexpectedly rapid counterattacks from Castro's military. The small Cuban Air Force was able to sink most of the exile supply ships, while the United States decided not to provide the necessary air support for even a chance of this to last beyond just a few hours, and so the expected uprising never happened. In the end of this embarrassing act, 100 of the attackers were killed and more than 1,100 were captured, with Fidel Castro's regime gaining the legitimacy it needed to rule the island for generations to come.
The very next year, in 1962, during one of the biggest flashpoints in the Cold War between the US and the USSR, it was discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba and targeting the United States as a response to American nuclear missiles stationed in the nearby Turkey, which is just a short distance away from the border of the USSR, and were aiming at targets all around the western parts of the country, including the capital and many other cities. After an intense 13-day game of chicken that nearly led to a nuclear apocalypse, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles after the United States promised to remove its ballistic missiles from Turkey. Just in front of this iconic Hotel Nacional de Cuba, there is a small museum on site that shares the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which here is called the October Crisis. The museum is located on top of a system of underground tunnels that form a circle beneath the hotel's gardens. Though there was never actually any nuclear weapons here, these tunnels housed periscopes used by Cuban intelligence in espionage efforts. These tunnels really punctuate the history and the seriousness of the tensions between the US and Cuba, and serve as a reminder of the tensions that still remain to this day. There's a lot of unexpected old world beauty to be had in this unique country. Nowhere else will you see a large metropolitan city where life goes on largely unchanged for over half a century, while trying to gain a foothold in the modern world. The people of Cuba have suffered a lot because of the unwillingness of their own leaders, as well as the leaders of the US and others, to finally move past the petty squabbles and ways of thinking that don't really benefit anyone in the 21st century. Changing one's totalitarian regime for another caused one form of repression to go to another with very few clear winners, which is a lesson that change just for the sake of change does not bring a positive result. In the next and final episode of this Cuban series, I'm going to wrap things up by showing the home of the legendary author and novelist Ernest Hemingway, and talk a little about his fascinating life as a war reporter and writer, who was torn between his life in the US and Cuba. I will also talk about the unique internet access setup that Cuba has today, and how this newly developing method of communication is preparing the country for the 21st century.
With this, I'm going to close out this episode. I sincerely hope that you enjoy watching this series of my past life. If you did, then I would appreciate it if you hit the like button and leave a comment with your thoughts on whatever it may be. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and click on the bell icon to receive notifications of my upcoming videos. Always take care of yourselves and each other, and of course, look out for more videos coming at you from the Time-Lapse Traveler.